Hey everybody, hope you're doing well. Today we're going to go ahead and talk a little bit more about cells. Last class we went ahead and focused on the microscope and a little bit of cell theory, and then gave you a brief overview of the major types of cells and some of the organelles that are found in all of them. Today we are going to go ahead and focus primarily on those organelles themselves and talk a little bit about where they're found in terms of plants or animals, as well as the primary functions of those organelles. So let's go ahead and start by taking a look at our essential questions. So, number one, what are the organelles that are found in all cells? You can refer back to the notes from last class, or we'll cover them again here today. Number two, what organelles are found in plant cells but not in animal cells? We have a few organelles that we'll talk about at the end of class today that are really not found in in animal cells, but are found in plant cells. So I want you to think about what those are and why it makes sense that those organelles are found in plants but not in animals. And then lastly, as we're going, we'll go ahead and cover the primary functions of the different organelles within these different types of cells. Okay, so one of the things that was covered after going over the different types of microscopes and cell theory were the different types of cells. And we classify these cells into two primary types, prokaryotic and eukaryotic. Now, prokaryotic cells contain three basic organelles that are found in all types of cells. These include things like cytoplasm, the cell membrane, and ribosomes. These are going to be cells that are mostly stuff like bacteria, really simple single-celled organisms, and most of them are pretty tiny. The second class is going to be eukaryotes. These include everything from you and me to other plants and fungus and protists, but these contain a lot more organelles than just those three we highlighted, including those with membrane-bound organelles. Okay, so that's definitely something you'll want to kind of keep track of, is this idea of membrane-bound organelles. Okay, so membranes. Let's go ahead and take a look at that. All right. Now, this is a sample prokaryote. Okay. Now you'll notice in this particular instance, we do not have a typical nucleus, what you'd think of as a nucleus. You still have DNA right here, but that DNA is in the nucleoid region. Okay, so it's kind of loosely amassed. It's not contained within a separate barrier. Okay, all cells are going to go ahead and have ribosomes, absolutely necessary, because these are the ones that go ahead and produce proteins. And proteins, as we mentioned, do all the heavy lifting inside the cell. When we go ahead and start looking at it, all cells are going to have an outer membrane, plasma membrane, as you can see here, because it has to regulate the inflow and outflow of materials, waste getting kicked out, and nutrients and food coming in. In addition to that, some of our prokaryotes, not all of them, have a cell wall. Okay, now that cell wall is really a rigid structure to help protect the cell from getting invaded by, say, a virus or something along those lines. So these are the main components that we typically see when we look at a prokaryotic cell. You'll also see the pili out here. These are primarily used for reproduction when we start looking at the cells. And you see some flagella down here, which are primarily for motion. Okay, but those are our typical characteristics, typical organelles that we see when we're looking at a prokaryote. Now, if we go ahead and move on to eukaryotes, we typically separate them into two primary categories. Yes, I know there are four. We have our plants, animals, but we also have fungi and protists. We're going to focus primarily on plants and animals. Now, this particular cell is an animal cell, and you can see that animal cells tend to have a nice round shape. Okay, so we can say round shape. They also tend to have structures that are dominated by the central nucleus. So the nucleus is the largest organelle. Now, that's not always true, but by and large, it's going to be true. And there are variations on this theme. Now, the cell that you're looking at here is a very generic cell. But we have to modify or adapt that generic cell to all the different functions it performs, whether it's a lung cell, whether it's a liver cell, whether it's a red blood cell, whether it's a neuron. All these different types of cells have different types of characteristics and different amounts and sizes of the different organelles to perform their functions optimally. Okay, so typically round in shape, and the nucleus is typically the largest of the organelles. Okay, so the next one that we typically talk about is the plant cell. Now you'll notice right away some big differences. Okay, in this one, typically your nucleus is not the largest organelle, but instead it's going to be our vacuole, our big central vacuole. Okay, so if we take a look at this vacuole here, this is typically going to be the largest thing in a plant cell, and hopefully you notice around the outside there's this big wall. So we have a cell wall here instead of just a cell membrane. The plasma membrane's still here, you'll notice, but it's inside the cell wall giving an extra layer of protection. And we'll talk a little bit about why that is as we go ahead and continue today. Okay, so let's go ahead and jump in. First things first, what are the characteristics that all cells exhibit? Yesterday, or last class, you guys probably remember going over these. Number one is a cell membrane. They have to have at least one that separates the inside of the cell from the outside environment. Two, cytoplasm. They have to have some fluid inside the cell for all the other things to be in and take place. And if you're going to be alive, you're going to carry out all the necessary functions of a cell, you have to have ribosomes, because ribosomes' job is to build proteins, and proteins do all the heavy lifting. Okay, so let's look at each one individually and talk about what they do. The first one is the cell membrane, and we'll actually have a full day just on the membrane because the functions performed by it are so crucial. I want you to kind of think of the cell membrane like a bouncer. Okay, it's what regulates what goes into and out of the cell. So think about a bouncer outside of a club. They're the ones that determine who gets in and who gets kicked back out. Okay, this is the primary job of the cell membrane. It does provide that outer coating to kind of separate inside and outside, and it's going to determine what gets in and what comes out. And when we talk more about the membrane, you'll hear this term semi-permeable or selectively permeable, which ends up being really important in terms of the structure of the cell. Okay, the next one that we're going to highlight is going to be the cytoplasm. Now, the cytoplasm is, most people think of it like a really thin fluid like water, but it's actually a little bit more like jello that hasn't set. So it's kind of gelatin-like, but it's definitely fluid and it definitely flows. And it's constantly moving. And if we were in class and we were doing our typical cell structure labs, you might even be able to see some cytoplasmic streaming as mitochondria are found and chloroplasts are found inside the cytoplasm. And you can actually see the chloroplasts moving around in things like an elodea leaf that's very fresh and getting a lot of sunlight. Okay. The next one, probably one of my favorites, is the ribosome. There are two primary types of ribosomes. You have your free ribosomes, which are just floating around in the cytoplasm, and then you have your attached ribosomes, which are actually found on the rough ER, or the endoplasmic reticulum, that we'll talk about later. Ribosomes are manufactured inside the nucleus, and in that nuclear region, in a particular dark area known as the Nucleolus, produces them inside of eukaryotes, and these are your protein factories. That is the primary job, but it is a crucial one, and all living organisms need to have it. So that covers the three primary organisms that are organelles that are found in all organisms. Okay, if it's alive and it has cells, all cells have these three organelles. Now we're going to move on to those organelles that are shared between plants and animals, and then we'll finish up with those that are found only in plants. So the list goes like this. We'll talk about the nucleus. All eukaryotic cells are going to go ahead and have a nucleus, but the nucleus has two special structures I want to go ahead and highlight here, the nucleolus and the nuclear membrane. We have the cytoskeleton, which it could or could not be considered its own organelle. Essentially, these are protein microfilaments that help give the cell its particular structure. Then we have the mitochondria, known as the powerhouse of the cell, the endoplasmic reticulum, which is kind of a conveyor belt system and also modifies some proteins. You have your Golgi apparatus, which is kind of like a packing and shipping center. It's going to send things out of the cell. You have your vacuole, which is like a storage space. And then you have your lysosomes, which are far more common in animal cells, but you do find them periodically in plant cells as well. All right, let's start at the top. Number one is the nucleus. The nucleus is really important, and in animal cells at least, it's typically the largest of all the organelles. This is going to direct all of your cellular activities and to protect your DNA. So you have to think about inside of the nucleus, we're going to use an extra protective layer for the original blueprints. And this is what your body does. It stores the DNA inside the nucleus, keeping it extra safe. And we typically make copies of that DNA and send it out to the ribosomes to do the jobs of manufacturing those proteins. Okay? This nucleus contains those instructions, which is what determines what kind of cell it is. It's going to determine what kind of organism it is. And, outside of the vacuole, it's still the second largest of the organelles that we find in plants. But there are two parts of that nucleus that I want to go ahead and highlight. Those are the nucleolus and the nuclear membrane. The nucleolus is the dense region that we go ahead and find inside the nucleus. You'll notice that there's a dense dark region here, and there's a dense dark region here. This nucleolus is important because it's composed of proteins and chromatin, and this is typically where you're going to go ahead and manufacture your ribosomes. You also see this incredibly important outer layer of the nucleus, which is very much like the cell membrane that separates the cell from the outer environment. This nuclear membrane is going to separate the nucleus from the rest of the cell. Okay? So it's that added layer of protection, and you'll notice that just like we're going to see a little later on with the cell membrane, you have these little nuclear pores or areas where you can get material going into the nucleus or coming out of the nucleus. Okay, so this is a really important pair of structures that we typically find in the nucleus that help them perform their job. All right. The next one is the cytoskeleton. So you got to think of this kind of like scaffolding. If you've ever walked past a building and you had construction workers or painters working on the outside of the building, after it's already kind of been built or the basic structure's been built, they put up what's called scaffolding. It's kind of that little metal framework that kind of allows them to move up and down on the side of the building. Well, you have something similar inside your cells, and its primary job is to actually go ahead and help the cell keep its shape so it doesn't squish too much, it doesn't get flattened or stretched in any way that's going to damage it and prevent it from doing its particular job. What this means, though, is that anything that's sitting inside the cytoplasm is going to have to kind of meander around within that cytoplasm to avoid these microfilaments of protein that make up the cytoskeleton. Okay. After the cytoskeleton, let's talk about the things that are floating around inside the cytoplasm, because the nucleus is fairly stable. It doesn't move around a whole lot. The cell membrane is pretty solid because it'll flex in and flex out as the cell gets squished and moved through passageways, but it pretty much stays where it is. And the cytoskeleton is largely responsible for keeping it there. But inside that cytoplasm is going to be organelles like the mitochondria. Now, these are the organelles that actually release the energy from the food that you eat. If you think about what we talked about in our important organic molecules for life, one of the big ones was the carbohydrates that provide you with so much of the energy you need to function. Well, we'll talk more as we get through this first semester about the different processes that this requires to take place in order to get that energy out of your food, but know that most of this takes place at your mitochondria. Okay? Commonly known as the powerhouse of the cell, this is what takes in oxygen and converts your food into the energy that you need. Now, the number of mitochondria per cell varies a lot, okay, because it depends on the energy needs of the particular cell. If you think about a cell like a fat cell, it doesn't do a whole lot. It simply sits there and stores fat for the most part. But a muscle cell that's constantly moving, constantly being active, may have as many as 20,000 mitochondria in a single cell. Okay, so wide range depending on the energy needs of the particular cell. The next of the organelles is the endoplasmic reticulum, more commonly known to most people as the ER, because endoplasmic reticulum, as fun as it is to say, is a mouthful. And there are two types of endoplasmic reticulum. We have the smooth ER and the rough ER. But both of them are going to transport materials within the cell. Okay, they're for shipment in the cell. And when we start dealing with the rough ER in particular, it's rough because it has these ribosomes attached to the outer surface, and that's going to allow it to go ahead and take and carry proteins where they need to go after they're manufactured, but that also is going to modify and add some structures to those particular proteins. So shouldn't be a surprise when we look at the smooth ER, it looks pretty smooth. When you look at the rough ER, it looks a little like sandpaper because you've got these dots on it, which are actually their ribosomes. Okay, so you can see them here, and it's a little harder to see over here, but you can tell this is the rough because you can see all these little dots here. Those little dots represent the ribosomes, and this is an actual photograph. So maybe I'll go ahead and label that. Those little dots are ribosomes. All right, and remember, ribosomes' primary job is to do what? That's right, to make proteins. And so while both of them transport materials in and around the cell, the rough ER is the one that's going to go ahead and modify some of those proteins as it's doing that shipment process. Okay, so, oops, too far. We got the Golgi apparatus next. The one thing that's difficult about the Golgi apparatus is that it often gets confused with the smooth ER, but their functions are different. While the smooth ER is for shipping inside the cell, the Golgi apparatus really starts packaging materials to ship outside the cell. It'll attach things like lipids to the material so it can get through the cell membrane and get out into other parts of the body. So you got a flattened sac of membranes really used for sorting and packing proteins for shipment. But again, the big emphasis here that separates this from, say, the smooth ER is that this is going to ship them outside of the cell. Okay, whereas the smooth ER is for internal to the cell, the Golgi apparatus is for shipping outside the cell. Okay, so then we move on to the vacuole. Now this one is quite different between the plants and the animals. Not its function, they're both using the vacuole for storage, but how it does that is quite different. Okay? We store things like food, water, waste, some temporary, some more long-term, but plants have a single large central vacuole, typically the largest organelle in the cell, versus animals tend to have several smaller vacuoles. So take a minute, I want you to think about why might animal cells have several smaller vacuoles as opposed to one large one that you see in plants. Pause here and think about it, see if you can come up with an answer. Okay, so I wonder what you thought of. Hopefully you're starting to look at what sort of things get stored in that vacuole. So if you think about food, water, waste, in a plant, those are all going to be stored together in that single central vacuole. But in an animal, we're actually going to go ahead and store these in separate vacuoles, which hopefully sounds more appealing to you. A big reason for this is that the waste products that we see in plants tend not to be as toxic, and older plant cells tend to kind of die off and it doesn't hurt the plant. These are problems that don't work well for the animal cell. So the animal cell is going to try and separate its food, water, and waste so that they're not contaminating the food and water for utilization later on. Now, we have some evidence that it seems to be true. Whether or not that is completely true remains to be evaluated completely. Then we get on to the lysosome. Now, the lysosome is kind of the assassin of the cells. Okay, its job is to go ahead and find and destroy. Now, some of that destruction is destroying foreign objects, okay, things that are not meant to be in the cell, like viruses, bacteria, that type of thing. But lysosomes do also break down things inside the cell, like old organelles that aren't working very well. But they also can help digest some of the food as well. So there's a lot of different functions they do. The term lyse is to kill or destroy, and so the actual, translation of lysosome is kill body. And it digests material, whether it's food particles or worn out cell parts, or even destroy the entire cell if the immune system tells it needs to, or when the cell is dying. And these are found in plants, although it is far more common to see these in animals than it is to see them in plants. And we have two more organelles I wanted to go ahead and highlight today, and these are organelles that are found in plants but not found in animals. They are the cell wall and the chloroplast. Okay? Now, let's start with the cell wall. The cell wall is what gives shape to the plant cell. It's typically going to be made of cellulose, which remember is one of our polymers when we start looking at carbohydrates. It's found in plants, fungi, but it's also found in many bacteria as well. So there are some prokaryotes that have a cell wall, but not all of them. Now, why would you think it is that animal cells do not have a cell wall? Pause the video here, think about why that might be. So what'd you come up with? If you said it's because plants don't have a skeleton, you'd be right. Okay? We have an internal physical structure that takes the place of the cell wall. We can move around because we've got these physical bones that make up our skeleton that allow for movement so that we're not a big puddle on the floor. Well, you got to think that even though trees, for example, don't have a skeleton, they're able to stand up 365 plus feet in some cases. Okay, that's a lot of rigidity, that's a lot of structure, and that comes at the cellular level rather than at the systemic level. Okay, so cell walls are found in plants because they don't have a skeleton, and they are not found in animals, but there are some bacteria that do have cell walls. The last organelle to talk about today is the chloroplast. Now, the chloroplast is going to be a little green bean-shaped organelle, and it's the cool organelle that actually takes sunlight and converts it into sugars for the plant. This is how the plant feeds itself. And it's really important because it's this little green thing because it has a green pigment known as chlorophyll, which absorbs the rays of sunlight and converts them into sugars, in particular the supersugar, glucose, that we'll talk a ton about as we go ahead and continue on with photosynthesis and respiration later on in this term. Okay, guys, that's all I've got for you. I hope you have a great day and you have some basic understanding of the different organelles and what their functions are, those that are in all cells and those that are found in plants but not found in animals. All right, have a great rest of your day. Talk to you guys soon. Take care.